I want to personally introduce the man behind Geoengineering Watch, who I appreciate. He's had the courage to raise this issue nationally and beyond, and he's taken the personal risk to expose what essentially is a covert government program where they're spraying toxic aerosols in the sky above our heads. After you see this presentation, you're never going to look up at the sky the same again. Dane's information is credible, it is accurate, he is a courageous man, and really, Dane is the reason that I came to this seminar, because people of courage are in short supply today. So, if you would, please give a warm welcome for Mr. Dane Wigington.
For those who are not familiar with geoengineeringwatch.org and our website, we exist as a resource tool for people to share with others, to wake them up to the fact that we're all literally part of a grand and lethal experiment. This is a call to action because it's one thing to know, it's another thing to actually take action. And that's what we really need to happen. So by sharing this data, we're trying to convey the information needed to wake others up, because we are truly in an existential fight. And the timeline is very short on many horizons if we don't change direction. So the point is we have to change direction. And people wonder how I got into this particular mess. And I have a background with Bechtel Power in the renewable energy industry. Bechtel Power is a dubious company that's really at the core of a global power center, if you will, like Halliburton. And I left that company at a very young age, at 22 years old, because of what I saw. I saw good men that had long since seemed to abandon their morality. And the way I got into this issue was having grown up in a very, very smoggy Southern California. And I wondered as a boy how the adults around me weren't alarmed at living in what was literally a toxic soup. And when I eventually got to the Pacific Northwest, built an off-grid home that was on the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine, and I began to lose massive amounts of my solar PV uptake from whatever these aircraft were leaving behind. Clearly could not be condensation to block 60, 70, 80% of my solar PV uptake. So in starting to research, finding the fundamental ingredients in climate engineering patents and testing my precipitation at the state-certified lab, I didn't want to find what I found there. I found massive amounts of aluminum, and those levels skyrocketed over the coming 18 months to levels that were as high as 3,450 parts per billion of aluminum in a single rain test. It's literally toxic rain. Now, this image is what our forests are beginning to look like. And we have agencies like U.S. Forest Service and USDA, and I know scientists from these organizations. I've worked with them in the field. And their job, like all federal agencies, is to hide these threats from the public. That's literally what their job is. And we have a system that's full of order followers. As Kevin, who's, for those of you that haven't heard Kevin speak, CIA officer Kevin Shipp, who would not go along with the system that tries to mask these threats from the public, because who would have the right to engineer our climate and make our forests look like that? And that's that type of sky our society has learned to accept as normal. There's nothing normal about that. We've been been programmed to accept a lot of things as normal, and we're marginalized by our media, by our meteorologists, by our climate science community. We're marginalized for trying to point out obvious truths. How big of an elephant in the room do we need when we see our skies grid patterned day in, day out, our forests dying? And now we have, as of about several weeks ago, let's try this. CIA.
Another example is the array of technologies, often referred to collectively as geoengineering, that potentially could help reverse the warming effects of global climate change. One that has gained my personal attention is stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, a method of seeding the stratosphere with particles that can help reflect the sun's heat in much the same way that volcanic eruptions do. an SAI program could limit global temperature increases, reducing some risks associated with higher temperatures and providing the world economy additional time to transition from fossil fuels. This process is also relatively inexpensive. The National Research Council estimates that a fully deployed SAI program would cost about $10 billion yearly. As promising as it may be, moving forward on SAI would also raise a number of challenges for our government and for the international community. On the technical side, greenhouse gas emission reductions would still have to accompany SAI to address other climate change effects, such as ocean acidification, because SAI alone would not remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. On the geopolitical side, the technology's potential to alter weather patterns and benefit certain regions of the world at the expense of other regions could trigger sharp opposition by some nations. Others might seize on SAI's benefits and back away from their commitment to carbon dioxide reductions. And as with other breakthrough technologies, global norms and standards are lacking to guide the deployment and implementation of SAI and other geoengineering initiatives.
How many think that that's acceptable? That we have the head of the CIA pretending that there could be some bad things happen when you fill the atmosphere with toxic metal particulates, about 20 million tons a year, that they would have the audacity to pretend they, one, have the right to do that, and two, that there could be any benefit in that whatsoever. How could there be any benefit in that at all? So now we have, again, with media trying to marginalize this issue as if it's not going on, it's becoming almost impossible to hide. And as you see, Kevin Shipp was up here earlier, and he knows how the CIA works, that this is an indication that they know they can't hide this much longer. And it's up to us to speed that process. If we don't speed that process and beat the power structure to the intersection so that we expose this issue before they're ready to have it exposed, we have to speed that pace up, because the damage being done is irreparable in countless ways, and it's increasing by the day. For those that don't know what geoengineering is, Brennan explained it partially, but the reason we are given for climate engineering is that they are going to put a sun shield up, toxic metal particulates, and no one ever mentions when he says it's relatively inexpensive, about $10 billion a year. What about the fact that we all inhale it with every single breath we take? Is that not an expense? How big of an expense is it when we have 1 out of 3 seniors in the U.S. dying with Alzheimer's and/or dementia? Not dying from it, but dying with it. And the list of human diseases that are associated with aluminum intake is off the scale. How expensive is that, Mr. Brennan? So when you see this type of diagram in science magazines everywhere that show that, that's exactly what's happening. And the other elements they show are simply distractions. Space mirrors, how feasible is that? And they put those kinds of things in there to make people write this whole issue off and walk away and ignore the jet in the air that's spraying them. So these are meant to distract. Now again, when people ask, this comes up all the time again, how do we prove this? How do we prove this is happening? Because we have film footage like this, and we have a lot of this at geoengineeringwatch.org. We have reels and reels of this type of footage, and if people don't believe what they see with their own eyes, there's nothing you can do to convince them. You're talking about somebody in that case that doesn't want to wake up, but this is the best way to try to wake somebody up, and sometimes it just takes time for that seed to sprout and grow. As people, I mean, even with my own background in renewable energy, I simply didn't realize this was happening until it affected my own solar PV uptake. And people know, in the solar industry, for example, I know people way up on the food chain in the solar industry, and they know this is going on. But by one means or another, all control leads back to those who control the purse strings. So even the people in the solar industry, with subsidies and other incentives, are kept silent. Just like the medical community is kept silent about vaccinations, universities are now silent because they're controlled. Monsanto, other agencies control parts of universities. Does anybody wonder where the state's $50 billion deficit, in this case of California, about $50 billion a year, where does that go every year? And that deficit is taken care of with central bank printed money that keeps all the agencies quiet, all the way down the line, right down here to our local Shasta County, who we know about the toxic contamination, and they're not disclosing it. It's part of the reason for our legal filing. We have some of our attorneys here. So bottom line is, how do they pay for this? Printed central bank money. Who are the they behind this? The central bankers. How do they keep the system silent? By controlling militaries and all the agencies down the line because they control the purse strings. Now, this is extremely compelling footage for those who haven't seen it. And this is the kind of footage that should be sent to people who you're trying to introduce this issue to. That's really, really important, as opposed to trying to point at the sky and rant to people, because that typically just sets off the defense mechanisms and people don't listen to anything you have to say. That's not condensation, period. Again, the why, I get the why all the time. Why are they doing it? And there's the answers to that question is there's a stated why and there's a why in reality. The stated purpose is to try to keep business as usual on planet Earth by trying to deflect some of the sun's incoming thermal energy, because the Earth's energy balance has been disrupted. And this is important for people to understand, that the amount of energy that came in compared to what went out, that equilibrium has been blown to bits. And what they're trying to do to keep business as usual, to keep the military-industrial complex moving forward, to keep the population blind to the fact that we are free-falling into a planet that will not support life. And this attempt to cover it up is comparable to, for those of you that know about the Gulf of Mexico oil spill and the chemical Corexit. Chemical banned throughout the globe, but they used it in the Gulf of Mexico not to make the situation better, but to hide it. And we have environmental impact reports that state Corexit made that situation 52 times more toxic, but they used it anyway. And we think they're still using it, by the way, at the wellhead. An independent expert on deep sea drilling, Matt Simmons, said that on CNN. He was dead 2 days later in his pool. So again, it's not a wonder why we don't have a lot of whistleblowers going on here. Plane interiors, lots of these photographs online. Now, some of these photographs are to do with issues other than climate engineering, but these photographs appear to be in a climate engineering interior. Those are 3,000 PSI collars on some of those tanks. These are not fire suppression units. These are aerosol operations, and there's a lot of these configurations. This is an ongoing experiment, so we see many combinations. Again, retrofit nozzles. We think we know where some of the facilities are that are doing this retrofitting now, and we're trying to gain the resources to do a private investigation to uncover more data and details. But these are commercial aircraft retrofit nozzles that feed right into the exhaust stream, so this looks like, quote, condensation. This is really important, that when you hear people, especially military people, will ask, why would our military do this? And if we know that the military, one, they listen to a lot of bad advice from scientists, don't they? They blew off 2,000 nuclear weapons. How good was that for the planet? And don't they know after a few dozen that they work? But they keep going and going. They blow up pristine South Sea islands with nuclear weapons. They blow nuclear weapons off in the atmosphere. For those of you who don't know what Project Starfish is, they blew off hydrogen bombs in the magnetosphere to see what would happen. So this is business as usual for the military-industrial complex, but when we know that they consider the disintegrating climate the greatest national security threat of all, do we really think they're going to ask our permission to engage in these programs? That notion is absurd. So certainly this is already going on. Again, this is very, very important to recognize what a natural sky is from one that's not. And this has come on so slowly and so insidiously that most Americans don't recognize, most people around the globe don't recognize natural cloud cover from aerosol artificial cloud cover. And they're putting in kids' films, I don't know how many of you have ever noticed, but Disney films, Over the Hedge, a lot of other films, the skies are full of aerosol particulate trails. And what does that do? It conditions our children to think this is normal. So let's take vaccinations that are harming our child's neurological function and cognitive function anyway, throw in some conditioning, and now you end up with a society that can't recognize something that is unimaginably, obviously wrong. This is important to remember also, as I've referred to many times, the level of deception that we're exposed to now is unimaginable. Everything we see is in one way or another filtered or spun. And to this degree especially, we have the same defense contractors that are involved in climate engineering control the modeling. So we have Raytheon doing all the modeling for National Weather Service and NOAA. Raytheon, a primary geoengineering contractor. FAA does it for or Lockheed Martin does it for the FAA. So they control what we see, bottom line, and they filter out what you see in the upper right corner. You don't see images like that unless you happen to catch one that didn't get filtered. And we see a lot of images like this now. So if people recognize that, they would understand just how severely the climate system is being affected. Radio frequency. Now, we have meteorologists on the Weather Channel. By the way, Weather Channel is owned by Bain Capital and Blackstone, two core global corporations. And they will explain away, for example, if you look at the upper right corner, clearly circular radio frequency transmissions affecting the cloud formations. And we have staggering photos of this, and they'll explain this away. For example, meteorologists on the Weather Channel, I don't know how they look themselves in the mirror or their children in the eyes, but they will explain this away as some sort of natural phenomenon when clearly our sense of reason should tell us it's not. So the particulates in the atmosphere are manipulated with radio frequency transmissions, and the goal, again back to the why, on solar radiation management, to expand available moisture into the widest cloud canopy possible. And although that deflects some of the sun's incoming thermal radiation, it also traps it. It shreds the ozone layer, it disrupts the hydrological cycle, and it renders toxic every single breath we take. More cloud formations, again, especially if you look at some blocked out areas where there's 90-degree corners blocked out of cloud cover. That's from radio frequency transmission. You can't get that kind of configuration naturally. Meteorologically speaking, you don't need to know much about meteorology to recognize that. Square cloud cut into stripes on the top. These are all completely unnatural phenomena. Radio frequency transmitters. We know that a lot of people are fighting the RF frequency from phone transmissions, correct? And that's certainly a problem. But the transmissions from some of the weather control on the cell towers, the NextRad towers that all of you see in town and cities and so forth, we know there's about 10 times more power being pumped into those facilities than they need. And the power transmissions from those facilities show up on radar maps for precipitation. We know they're being used with these programs. So the bottom line is we're being exposed to much more radio frequency transmission than we realize, or certainly it's even being disclosed. And these facilities also are tearing holes in the atmosphere, quite literally. In fact, there's a documentary called HARP, Holes in Heaven. It's a very good documentary you can watch in full online, narrated by Martin Sheen. We'll explain this phenomena even more. HARP facilities around the globe. Again, the military has a document called Owning the Weather. And that's a very revealing document at their attempt to use weather as what they call a force multiplier. And we have a long history of the military using these weapons to control populations. And why would we consider this anything less in California? In the case here, if you search drought, engineered drought in California, you can find much more data. But we know that the drought in California is a direct result of climate engineering, not climate change. Not that climate change is not real. It's extremely dire, much more so than Al Gore has ever said. We're facing what would be more correctly categorized as a climate shift, an abrupt climate shift. In fact, the latest frontline data we have indicates that on the current trajectory, we may be looking at an 8-degree C rise by 2025. No complex organisms survive. 8 degrees C is about 16 degrees Fahrenheit. On this trajectory, that's where we're heading. Yes, it couldn't get much more dire than that. But what does that mean? That we sit down and do nothing? It means we do everything we can to try to expose and halt these programs which are fueling that fire. But their attempt to control the weather is absolutely global. Again, stunning examples. We have a web page now called Geoengineering Watch Photo Gallery, and we have photographs from around the globe like this. And populations are waking up. Their conditioning is breaking down. They're realizing the weather is cataclysmically wrong. So this drought deluge phenomenon that we have, when you interfere with the system and you migrate moisture across one area like California, and we could consider California a climate sacrifice zone. If we want to be optimistic and give the benefit of the doubt to those in power and say maybe they're trying to do something constructive, they're not. But even if we looked at it through that lens, it breaks down when we look at the fact that they are relentlessly scattering moisture that comes over California, so much so that we can only really see California as not just a climate sacrifice zone, but a target, because we see them over the top of even monsoonal moisture, thunderheads, every bit of moisture that comes over, they're aerosolizing it. And how often does the rain come late and less, if it comes at all? And the atmosphere dries out very quickly because These particles are desiccants. They accrete all available moisture. And how many people see dew in the morning anymore? We've forgotten that we don't even see that. Under very rare occasions do you see it because the atmosphere is drying out. That sucks the moisture out of everything else. Weather as a force multiplier, what I just mentioned, the lower left. UN documentation, congressional documents. We have study after study after study, but no, it's not happening. And that's what we hear. That's what we hear from our local media. That's what we hear from KRCR. That's what we hear from science environmental groups like Greenpeace. I debated Greenpeace's, or discussed, it was a discussion debate, Greenpeace's top scientists on national radio. And clearly anybody who listened to that would know that he knew these programs were going on, but they're simply trying to protect their 501c3s so that they won't admit to these programs. Environmental groups are showing an immense amount of hypocrisy. Droughts are expanding around the globe. We have 1,000-year droughts happening all over the globe. We have 1,000-year floods. So when you disrupt the moisture from falling in one spot, it's going to come down somewhere else. And they can manipulate that as well by causing the atmospheric particulates to expand, repel each other, or to coagulate, attract each other, form big enough condensation nuclei to fall. And as climate engineering feeds these droughts, by the way, you have boreal forests now, the second greatest source of oxygen on the planet, that are now, instead of becoming carbon sinks and absorbing carbon, they're dying, so they're releasing carbon, so it starts to feed into the cycle, warming the planet even more. And what do the climate engineers in the military-industrial complex do? They increase the size of the programs. They keep doubling down. This is important. There's been 2 studies done, peer-reviewed studies approved, and those studies were then rescinded, just like what happened to Dr. Andrew Wakefield. Valid studies proving the signature on the composition of the metals and chemicals in rain samples matched the signature in coal fly ash. But once that study started to gain some notoriety and some attention, the institution that published that was leaned on and those studies were rescinded. And the reason, on climate engineering, again, the reason I'm so focused on this issue is because it's an existential threat. It's tearing the planet's life support systems apart. This is not a battle I ever wanted because I'm not politically minded and I'm not an activist, if you will. And as I've stated many times before, I'm a father, and I want a planet that supports life for my children, period. But when we lose the trees, when we lose the oceans, that's game over at that point. And it's happening around us by the day. This is where all of us need to wake those up around us. I mean, the trees are dead everywhere. They're dying all around us, period. I tried to bring this to light 10 years ago. It wasn't as visible then, but now it's astoundingly visible and starting to become something that's impossible to hide, thus John Brennan having to address the issue. Bees with Alzheimer's and dementia, and this is a very important study too. If you're trying to convince somebody this is going on, just challenge them to go Google search bees aluminum. You'll find peer-reviewed study after study after study. And if the bees are exposed, why would we not be exposed? And this is where our premise, when we know glyphosate and other chemicals are killing the bees near farm areas, but our contention with some of the world's beekeepers, some of the top ones in the US, was that if the bees are just as dead 1,000 miles into the wilderness, how can there not be a bigger factor? If we know our rain's full of aluminum, why would pollen not be full of aluminum as well? So if the bees die, again, not just if the oceans die, we die. If the ozone layer disappears, we die. If the trees die, we die. If the bees die, we die. All of these are converging at once. So we're back to the point of where we have to deal with this issue. That's why it's a priority issue. This is the gaping hole in the bottom of the boat if we're going to keep a planet that supports life. Autism, everybody knows it's going off the chart, percentage-wise, and I'll let the Vaxxed people elaborate on that further. But if you guys haven't seen the Vaxxed film yet, Stephanie Sinoff from MIT, actually the initial figures she publicized, I know in Vaxxed, I think she moved those figures back a little bit, but she initially publicized on the current trajectory, and this is from MIT, by the way, that we will have every other child with autism by 2025. I think they're showing a little bit later now to allow a little more cushion to what they've stated. But aside from all the biosphere factors I just mentioned, if we have a society with every other child with autism, that society can't function. And that doesn't mean the child without autism is healthy. They're not healthy. And that means all of us are exposed to the same, not just from vaccinations, but from the climate engineering issue. And all these metals combined, it's called synergistic toxicity. So we know we have peer-reviewed study on mercury and aluminum. We know we have mercury in our mouths. And this is where, again, when people say, believe the experts, we need to listen to the experts and disconnect our sense of reason. Why would we disconnect our sense of reason? When we know they put mercury in our mouths. What medical professional would put mercury in your mouth? And fluoride in our toothpaste, a known neurotoxin. Why would they put fluoride in our toothpaste? And I'm working with an EPA District 6 representative right now that's being fired because he tried to bring to light the fact that there's aluminum in our rain, which he relates to climate engineering, and it's combining with fluoride in the water for an incredibly lethal mix to the human race. And they're in the process of firing him right now, and we're communicating with them constantly. And that's what's done to whistleblowers. Their careers are ruined, lives are ruined, and that's why we have a society that's literally pushing itself towards certain suicide on this particular trajectory because the system won't let the truth be revealed. Dead and dying oceans. Many of you have probably heard about the algae blooms that are happening in Florida and so forth. How many have seen that much algae on an ocean? That's a beach in China. We don't hear about it here. We don't hear about the fact that in China there was a flood that happened about 2 weeks ago. It was so bad, 50,000 homes were wiped out. 2 million rescue workers were called out. Did anybody hear about that? 2 million rescue workers. And every time one of these disasters happened, Mongolia lost 80% of their farmland, or their crops, 80% this year. And how long can this go on? How many people know that in Caracas, Venezuela, they're going through such turmoil that people in Caracas are looking for pets for food? That's how bad it is. We don't hear any of that here. So the power structure will do everything they can to hide the severity of what's unfolding to the last possible minute. And too many people think if you can walk into Costco and the shelf is full, everything's fine. If McDonald's serving up Big Macs and Wally World's open, everything's good. So we need to break this paradigm because the planet is imploding. Dead zones in the ocean. Not going to be eating fish much longer. I wouldn't recommend anybody eat fish anyway. Farmed salmon is one of the most toxic foods you can eat, period. And we have now, with radiation in the Pacific, we have Corexit and other chemicals in the Gulf of Mexico. And bottom line is, I'm sorry to say this, but right now fish should be off the diet for anyone. And the dead zones are expanding. We have dead zones of 10,000 square miles or more where nothing lives. And jellyfish, by the way, are starting to take over in those zones because jellyfish survive in oxygenous zones. And every time man tries to intervene with the system, you get a bad result, every time. In the case of jellyfish, there's jellyfish, a species in Japan that's about 9 feet across, weighs several hundred pounds. So what did the Japanese try to do? They tried to intervene with nature again. They built nets to strain and cut the jellyfish up. And what causes a jellyfish to reproduce? Exactly that, when they're dismembered. So now they have 10 times more, 1,000 times more, and they can't catch any fish because the jellyfish are so heavy they break the nets. Every time you intervene with nature, you get a horrific result. When will man learn this? When will he learn that technology has brought us to the point of certain extinction? It's not saving us when it's used incorrectly. Noctilucent clouds, they look beautiful, but very, very ominous. And let me show you why. We think this is going on right now. I didn't elaborate on this in the earlier presentation. I'm going to elaborate on it now. What you see in the upper left is a methane blowhole, because methane hydrate fields and methane clathrate are warming and thawing, and it blows out of the ocean. When you see a hole like that, that's been happening in the Bermuda Triangle for decades. That's why the ships sink there. Because as the water warms, a methane field blows out, aerates the water like a bottle of champagne, ships have no buoyancy, they sink. It's happening on land now as well. So as that's happening, the atmosphere is filling with methane. It's covering the planet like a layer of glass. It's trapping the heat. More technology to the rescue, right? Project Lucy and Project Alamo, what you see in the lower right. And we think that's happening right now, going back to the previous frame with the noctilucent clouds. These programs are a desperate and unimaginably dangerous attempt to microwave the upper atmosphere with opposing frequencies to try to degrade some of that methane with unknown consequences. And that may be a reason why we're getting some of the noctilucent clouds right now. So this is one layer of insanity heaped on top of another, on top of another. Geoengineering has left Earth perilously exposed to solar flares. This is where, if Many of you have probably heard during a solar flare, grids can shut down, electricity grids can overload and shut down. So now if we have a completely damaged ozone layer, Earth's natural protection's gone, a massive solar flare will shut grids down all over the world. That'll prevent nuclear plants from being able to cool themselves. And now we may have a whole bunch of Fukushimas. Fukushima's a nuclear volcano with no end in sight. No end in sight. No technology to fix it, period. And they're building more nuclear plants right now. So again, when people say they, the proverbial they, military-industrial complex, central bankers, they wouldn't do this to themselves. How many examples like Fukushima do we need to know that we're not dealing with sanity? These are important statistics, so I'll go into a little more detail than I did in the last presentation. So we have species extinction rates going off the charts. In the last 40 years, and this is a particularly revealing statistics, in the last 40 years, we've lost about 60% of Earth's wildlife populations. 60%. During that time, human populations have doubled. How long do we think that can continue on? And the bottom line fact here is that if the population does not wake up to the trend that's going on, if they don't wake from their stupor and realize, again, that we are on a trajectory that not only can't be sustained, it's a trajectory leading towards certain suicide. And the types of cities you see in the lower left, how long can that type of growth be maintained on a finite planet with finite resources? And a lot of people don't want to hear this, and I know that. And I hear a lot that I need to not say these kinds of things. But if I don't say this, if I toe the line with what so many other people are saying because they don't want to upset anyone, how can we wake up? How can we wake up? And I would argue this, if I don't tell the whole truth, how can we change direction? Because a boat can't float if it's mostly watertight. It has to be completely watertight. We have to tell the whole truth. The bottom line is we have to change directions, and the single greatest thing we could do, if we expose climate engineering, every human being around the planet has been hurt equally by climate engineering. And that would be the greatest catalyzing factor, catalyzing cause that we could ever have. And if we can unite populations around the globe and understand what their governments have done to them, either actively or passively, that's our best chance to overturn the current paradigm, period. The Anthropocene is the age of man. That's the name of the epoch of the age of man, which we are in right now. Man has unimaginably altered the planet. And you hear people also, how many people parrot the official narrative, whether it's if you don't accept the 9/11 that buildings that never got hit by anything, like Building 7, collapse from some furniture burning in the first floor. If you question that, you're a conspiracy theorist. If you question vaccine safety, you're a conspiracy theorist. If you recognize you shouldn't have grid patterns in the sky one day and nothing the next, you're a conspiracy theorist. But don't accept that programming. And those who do repeat that kind of narrative are simply acting like trained parrots. Pass on data and move on. And those who think that man could not have altered the planet in any way, my God, where's reason in that equation? I mean, our forests are burning to the ground, we're paving the planet, we're poisoning the oceans, and we're ripping the planet's life support systems apart. And the planet, by the way, is on the edge of the habitable zone. We're on the outer edge of the Goldilocks zone, which means the habitable zone of the orbit around the Earth. Once we interrupt that energy balance, we enter a runaway greenhouse effect, Venus syndrome. All things being equal, Venus would be about 20 to 25 degrees warmer than Earth. It's 900 degrees in the surface because its atmosphere, its oceans are now in the atmosphere. Its atmosphere is 100 times more dense than Earth, and that's the path we're on right now if we don't change directions. Again, this was taken over Yosemite. As I stated in the last presentation, this was passed on to the president of the National Academy of Sciences, Marcia McNutt, who I communicated with last week because of our press release for a 60-day notice for legal action. And my point with this with her was to ask her, Ms. McNutt, do you believe that this picture taken over Yosemite National Park, do you believe that that could possibly be commercial traffic? How do you answer that with a straight face? How could you possibly claim that's commercial traffic? And this is the kind of tool you need to use. When you're trying to introduce this issue to others, you need to have tools like this at your disposal and use your best tools first to try to wake people up. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather it exists in the strength to face reality and take action in spite of it. And these are, all of us need some sort of simple mantra to keep motivating us to push on. And I know through difficult times in my life, and this has been a long and difficult road for me, my family's put up with it, and my wife, who's here in the audience, has put up with it, and is an immense help to me now. And I know in my mind I've pictured this mountain out across a deep, dark forest that I have to get to, and it seems impossibly far away. But I know if I keep my compass heading and I keep marching, I'll end up there. And I think we all need to keep that kind of a compass heading every day with all the struggles that we have. If we focus on the greatest priority of all, what could be a greater priority than attempting to save and salvage what's left of Earth's life support systems, to bring an issue to light that no one anywhere can escape from? And this is that issue. Climate engineering is nothing short of weather warfare. And because the materials are highly toxic, it's nothing short of biological warfare. And we know these materials are ending up in the entire web of life. They're bioavailable. A researcher in Norway that I know, they tested the native grasses to find out and determine how much of this material was being absorbed in their cows, their bovine. And they calculated over the course of the year, because of the metals the grasses were absorbing, a cow would ingest over 1/2 kilo of aluminum. That's a phenomenal amount. It's a wonder anything's alive. And we've seen, again, soil pH changes here in Shasta County escalate towards alkaline, an unimaginable amount, because there's that much aluminum coming down in our rainfall. And the bottom statement is most important of all, because we live in a society that says, don't think negative things, just think positively. Just think happy thoughts and everything will work out. And I'm all for trying to not overburden oneself till you become dysfunctional. But the bottom line is, as the bottom statement says, the hallmark of a healthy and rational mind is most forcefully displayed by an unyielding willingness to face the truth no matter how dire or dark. That's a healthy mind. You don't stand in the middle of a freeway and turn your back to traffic, do you? And I've used that example a lot. For those of you that I've tried to introduce this to family and friends, it goes completely against their paradigm of reality, and they resist it. And I know this, because my family has more or less disowned me completely, except my immediate family. But I can't change that. I can only answer to my call of conscience, and this is where to thine own self, this is what this means, to thine own self be true. If we ignore our conscience, what are we? And if we don't ignore our conscience and we take action every day, if any one of you passed on credible data to 2 people at the beginning of the first day of the month, and them to 2 each the second day, and so on for 30 days. I use this equation a lot because it really points out how much of a difference we can make. That's 5.5 million at the end of 30 days. Anyone in this room could be the final pebble that causes the avalanche of awareness, and we're getting close. We're getting close to a tipping point. That's where critical mass comes in. As we wake up our military brothers and sisters, people in agencies. I was just in, as I shared the last presentation in Well. In fact, his name, I believe, is George Day. There's someone who lives here in Redding named George Day that works at the California EPA in Redding. And I went in to see him to pass data on 2 weeks ago, which he didn't want. And he made it clear he didn't give a damn about this issue. EPA water quality testing didn't give a damn. And now they've been served from our attorneys. So perhaps this tune might change. And we should use those tools, be effective and efficient when you share data. Make a copy of that 30-page notice to pass out to people. Get some of our flyers, and they're free. You can grab a lot of our flyers, take them with you, and pass them out. You can download from our site and make more flyers, and that's a very, very helpful key to the door. It's better than orally dissertating. Have something to pass on to people. Again, final tool. We have a website full of videos like this. If someone can look at that and claim that that's just condensation, they don't want to wake up, at least at that moment. But if you plant that seed as people are forced to wake up, and converging scenarios right now will soon force people to wake up. This is an important point to remember for anybody who's deterred by trying to share this information, by the resistance of friends and family. Know this: they'll very soon be forced to wake up. Unfolding conditions will dictate that. So you will be vindicated soon enough. Keep planting those seeds so that once those people are forced to wake up, they'll have enough dots to connect to form a picture of where we're heading exactly. So we will continue our legal efforts on every front. We're getting support from behind the scenes now, environmentally speaking. And with everybody who's come here, never underestimate the difference that you can make if you simply make your voice heard. And that's a lie that we've been fed and told and too many people believe. And I've heard it more times than I can say. What you're doing doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference. But when I have people reach me back and say, I thought you were crazy, but I see it now, it's happening. And they're passing out DVDs and flyers. And I know and believe if everything I did, this whole journey of 15 years in this battle, if it was to wake that one single person up, it would have been worth it to me. But when I see a room full of people, and we'll have more, we had a lot this morning, and our data is circulating a lot in geoengineeringwatch.org. We have about 20,000 visitors a day now. We're up to 24 million. So that's a combined effort from all of us, from everything you're doing in the field, all of us working together, all of us pushing towards critical mass, toward that tipping point. So don't ever let anyone tell you you don't matter in this equation. And if we push together, even at this late hour, we may yet do astounding good if we all pull together. Thank you.